The world's biggest toy maker recalls millions of its products in the latest scare involving goods made in China. But while consumers in the West may be protected, what happens in developing countries where people have few rights and laws? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Darren Jordan. Well, the world's biggest toy maker is recalling some 18 million toys made in China, which it says could be harmful to children. The US toy giant Mattel says it's concerned about levels of lead paint and potentially loose magnets in the items. It's the second time in less than a fortnight the company's recalled Chinese-made toys. This is just the latest in a series of scares across the globe about products manufactured in China. They range from tainted seafood to toys and toxic toothpaste. Medicines with ingredients traced back to China are believed to have claimed scores of lives. Anar Verji has more.
Seafood, sweets, toothpaste. These are just some of the Chinese products that have been recalled in the past few months. In June, the U.S. recalled some types of seafood imported from China after its Food and Drug Administration found illegal substances in farm-raised fish and shrimp. In the Philippines, the Government Food and Drugs Agency banned some Chinese foods, including these sweets, claiming they found harmful chemicals in them. And in May, countries across the Americas reported finding dangerous syrup in toothpaste. Panama says that same toxic syrup was mixed into cold medicine and killed at least 100 people. U.S. President George Bush responded to the scares by announcing a panel to examine regulations of imported goods.
Part of our strategy will be to work with our countries from which we import goods to make sure that their procedures and practices will give us comfort. And finally, we'll be working with companies that import goods from around the world to make sure that their practices meet the high standards that we set for the United States.
And it's not just Washington calling for more regulations. Japan and the EU are pushing China to increase inspections.
We're working very hard with the Chinese authorities for training, information exchange. They have access to our system for notification so that they can follow up with producers and manufacturers in China.
Beijing says it tests products at places like this food safety lab, and that rejected products are confiscated and destroyed. And China is taking other measures. Last month, the Chinese government executed its former food and drug safety chief for taking bribes in return for approving substandard products. Some saw the tough sentence as an attempt to address concerns over food safety. But with concerns about Chinese products coming increasingly into light, many consumers are asking whether much more needs to be done.
So what do consumers think of products made in China? Well, we gauged public opinion in two cities, Kuala Lumpur and London. Here's what they said.
Well, I think everybody expects a certain quality when they're buying Chinese-made goods anyway. So it's up to the people importing them to take into account what the regulations are in their own country.
In my country, it is they refer the Chinese products because it is cheap, you know that. It is quite cheap and no problem for safety.
My first impression about the product is that, usually they are fake and imitation, so the quality is quite low.
Well, you get good stuff and some of it break easily or they're not of high quality. They cause you aches and pains and throw-ups. It really depends on what you buy though.
I buy the Chinese good with the quality control. I'm the biggest importer of Chinese machinery in Saudi Arabia. So, but we monitor the quality.
Maybe in the future I will be a little bit more, I will look a little bit more at the products and their quality, but I have no problem with the Chinese products, really.
Maybe it's a problem because of the standards we have in Western Europe. And there are not the same standards of production and so on.
I think the problem is, it's so much cheap labour nowadays, isn't it, that are coming from these countries, whereas I think we should have more homegrown products, to be honest.
Well, joining us now, our guests in London, Dr. Linda Yu, an expert on Chinese economic policy from Oxford University. In Washington, Julie Valise from the US Consumer Product Safety Commission. And in Geneva, Dr. Jenny Pronchuk, who's a medical officer at the World Health Organization. Welcome to the programme, ladies. Julie Valise in Washington, let me start with you, if I may. I mean, how surprised were you by this massive recall by Mattel? And are we likely to see things get worse as the Chinese economy keeps booming?
Well, frankly, recalls are not a new phenomenon here in the United States. Since the CPSC opened its doors, the regulatory agency that oversees toys, we have been announcing recalls, and we have been announcing recalls all this year as well. The fact that they are big companies with large numbers of products is a concern to this agency. And frankly, when you have a product that has lead paint, something that has been banned in the United States for almost 3 decades, that is a concern because it is unacceptable to have a banned hazardous substance coming into the United States.
Dr. Linda Yu in London, this is just the latest, as we were saying, in a series of scandals involving not just toys. There have been problems with pet food, seafood, toothpaste, tyres and many more. Is this a case of China's regulations haven't caught up with its booming economy yet?
That's absolutely what it is. China is a very unusual country in that it's the world's 4th largest economy, the 3rd largest trader, but it has the infrastructure of a developing country. Per capita GDP is less than $3,000 US. That gives you an indication of China's status, which still needs a lot more infrastructure to support what its aggregate income and aggregate output otherwise suggests.
Dr. Jenny Pronchuk in Geneva, from where you sit at the WHO, how worried are you by the scale of what you're seeing here?
Well, we are very worried in WHO about human health, certainly, and about pollutants in the environment of everybody, and especially of children, because our children are more vulnerable. So actually, we're very concerned about lead in many other materials, not only paint, because it can reach the children who are, you know, they have special behaviors, they put everything in their mouth, so that long-time chronic exposure can lead to accumulation of this heavy metal in the children and then produce an effect. But, you know, you need a long-time exposure, but as I said before, children take everything to the mouth, they touch, they play, they stay in contact. So actually there is a risk of exposure to lead in paint. And actually this is a long story because already in 1904, there were documented cases of lead poisoning in children because of paint in the houses. So actually it's an old problem that reemerged, and we are concerned in this case because it's obvious that the problem has a scale larger than the one we thought initially.
OK, let's bring back Julie Valise in Washington there. Julie, do you think these latest scares have prompted more vigilance from trading standards and consumer protection organizations like yours in the US and in the West generally?
Well, the CPSC is very vigilant as it is. We don't need a large recall in order to be vigilant in what we do. You know, the regulations and standards, the rules that the CPSC enforces are very, very clear in terms of importer responsibility into the United States. What they need to do in order to meet U.S. strict safety standards. Toys are the most heavily regulated product under the CPSC's jurisdiction, and companies understand what those regulations are. It's a matter of making sure that that gets communicated across the oceans into foreign countries, regardless of what country it is, on the need to meet U.S. strict safety standards. It is the importer of records responsibility, and we hold those importers to that responsibility very strictly. There are consequences for companies that don't live up to that responsibility, and we really hope that by having these companies meet our safety standards, because they are so strict, that will improve safety globally in other countries that may not have those same strict rules and standards that the United States does.
Dr. Linda, you in London, let me bring you back here because Julie Valise makes an important point about responsibility. But I mean, how much pressure are Chinese manufacturers under if Western companies, the big multinational companies, are pushing them for even lower and lower production costs? At the end of the day, they will cut corners, won't they?
I think this case and some of the other cases indicate that there is cutting of corners and there is some corruption at the ground level for Chinese firms. I mean, I think the point is well taken in that globalization has caused lots of multinationals from Western countries to locate in developing countries. And the fact that they haven't transplanted all of their high standards into developing countries is an issue to discuss and to think about. And I think one of the defenses multinationals tend to bring up is that they don't really influence the regulatory structure of the host country. But I do think that there has to be a bit of a conversation and balance there between what the multinationals' responsibilities are and really helping the host country, the developing country, come up to speed to what are established international consumers, what should be international consumer standards. And they don't need to reinvent the wheel and start the process from the beginning. So I think the fact that more than 50% of Chinese exports are produced by multinational corporations suggests that China's might is really an indication of the growth of offshoring and outsourcing. And I think that these two forces do have to think harder about communicating so that they won't jeopardize the quality of goods, and there's no reason why it should.
But how worried do you think the Chinese government is at present about this scandal?
They're very concerned about it. I think on the one hand, what they're saying is that it hasn't affected their trade figures, and that is true. China is on course to have a record trade surplus of about $250 billion this year. But I think they're also aware the longer-term consequences is that if they lose their reputation for producing safe goods, then they will jeopardize export growth in the future. And China is still a developing country which very much needs to access global markets. The challenge that the Chinese authorities have is that they don't have well-developed policy implementation processes. So even if the center is rooting out corruption, implementing standards, the localities still have to actually implement those with officials to do regulatory checks, to root out corruption at a very local level, and have skilled and trained personnel able to inspect factories and make sure that they are doing everything by the book. Well, and that's a huge challenge, and it may take years.
OK, well, let's just bring back Dr. Jenny Pronchuk in Geneva in this. I mean, we hear some of those figures, a trade surplus of $250 billion, something like 80% of the world's toys are made in China. Do you think this economic boom is somehow having a negative impact on the possibility of people's health in terms of all the consumers who are buying all these toys?
Well, in WHO, I mean, it's precisely for that type of reason that may be affecting China or maybe other countries that are producing similar products, is the fact that we have to ensure that there are some safety levels respected, in the sense that, for example, WHO set out guidelines of what's admissible in drinking water or in the food per week. So we have said we have a normative role that says, you know, up to a certain level it is tolerable, and those levels country should try to adhere to. Now, so yes, we are concerned, and yes, we are concerned about the situation in developing countries where those standards and regulations are not so strictly imposed or respected or enforced. But our concern is human health and the health of the children that may be exposed, as we know much more nowadays about the special vulnerability of children when they are exposed to environmental pollutants, and we know much more about how a toxic metal such as lead can interfere in the normal development of children.
OK, well, time for a short break now. But when we come back, how big is the problem in the developing world and what's being done to tackle it? Stay with us.